Hi, I'm Kylie.
And I'm Mandy.
And we're developers at Crema. Today we're going to talk about what React is, why you should learn it, and how you could learn it.
And then we're also going to get into some key terms and ideas that might be confusing as you're getting started.
So let's start off with what is React? React is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. If you think about the building blocks that you're used to working with, such as JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, what React does is it creates building blocks to allow you to create reusable components for the user interface. So if I'm creating an application and I need a nav bar on every page, then I'm not going to want to continuously have to recode that same nav bar. With React, I can create a nav bar component and then reuse just that component on each page. So you might be thinking, why would I want to use React? One reason to use React is it gives you a virtual DOM. We'll get into that a little bit later in more detail, but just know that it gives you the ability to not have to reload the whole page the entire time you're working with an application. Also, there's a lot of libraries out there that you can reuse their components, which kind of makes the process easier. It's kind of, you're not recreating the wheel every time. Also, you're still using JavaScript, so it's not like you're learning something that can't be applied to other frameworks in the future. So what do you need to know before learning React? I would say that knowing basic HTML, CSS, and JavaScript would be helpful because then you're not trying to learn those core concepts while also trying to learn React. And I would also say that it's not 100% necessary, but it would be nice to have an understanding of object-oriented programming and also functional programming. You'll be able to learn more about those along the way when you're learning React, but it might be a little beneficial in the beginning to know at least the basics of those. A lot of people are curious about how long it takes to learn React, and I think that the answer to that question is it really depends on the person and the amount of time you can dedicate to it. React is always coming out with new improvements to their library, and so it's one of those continuous learning processes where you're never going to stop learning. Here's some tips to help you improve while you're learning React. One thing that I found super helpful is continuing to practice every day as much as you can. It's one of those things where I will see someone who's more experienced than me, a senior developer, and I'll get caught up in thinking, oh my gosh, they are so much smarter than me, they know everything. Really, it comes down to they were where I was once, and it's kind of learning to accept that and understanding, okay, I can do this, I just need to keep practicing, and one day I'll be that senior developer. Also, making sure that you share what you're learning. I found it really helpful to teach others the concepts that I'm learning because it also helps you be able to figure out how to word an explanation and if you really are grasping that concept or if it's something you need to revisit. Also, something else that's really helpful is figuring out what way you learn best. I've found that I'm a very visual learner, so if someone's able to draw something out or if I can watch a tutorial, that's really helpful for me. So just find out what way works best for you and utilize that in your learning. There are a ton of resources online about React, and we've linked some of our favorites down below in the description box.
So now that Kylie has gone through an overview of what React is, we're going to get into a little bit more of the nuts and bolts and look at some key terms and concepts that will help you as you're getting into React. So the first thing we're going to talk about is a concept called JSX. If you're looking at one of these components here, so right now I'm just on the react.js website, which has some great documentation. Remember, like one of the first things I thought was weird when I was learning React is this syntax of having what looks like HTML wrapped up and mixed with JavaScript. And you can see if you just uncheck this JSX button right here, it shows you what this looks like in plain HTML. And one of the benefits of JSX is that because it does look like HTML and function in sort of the same way, you can get into React more quickly because you're familiar with the format of it. And it's easy to just think of it as basically a way to connect your HTML to JavaScript instead of having separate files with HTML file linked to a JavaScript file or a script file. It's just all there encapsulated into one component. Another concept that you'll hear about in React is Babel. It takes that JSX code that you're writing and compiles that down into JavaScript that your browser can understand. So if you've worked with HTML or JavaScript before, then you're probably familiar with the idea of the DOM, or the Document Object Model, which is basically a way for your JavaScript to interact with your HTML. It'll know where on the screen your different elements are. So it's basically like a tree. If you have a table element, then within that would be table rows and table data. So the benefit of React in all of that is that React works with something called the virtual DOM. Traditionally, if you're not using React or another framework, anytime that something on your site updates, the entire DOM has to be re-rendered, which can be pretty costly and cause your site to go slower. But with the virtual DOM, what React does is essentially take a snapshot of the DOM, so then it's not re-rendering that every time. And it just looks at that one part that's changing. It doesn't re-render the entire DOM, it only re-renders the components that actually need to be changed. So as you're getting into React, something that you'll hear right off the bat is the idea of stateful or stateless components. So a stateful component is just what it sounds like. It holds a piece of state, which is just kind of like a variable within a component that can change over time in that component. So you can have components that hold their own state, and you can also have components that are stateless, which do not. And that also introduces the concept of having parent components and child components. So a lot of times you'll see a parent component hold a piece of state that it passes down to its child, and that child component doesn't need to know necessarily what information is being passed to it. It just knows I'm going to get this variable or this prop, which is another concept we'll get into, and that child that is stateless doesn't have to keep track of another variable. So on React's website here, we have just on their homepage an example of a stateful component. And we have this component called timer, and you'll see that in this constructor method, we have state that's being defined, and the piece of state right there is seconds, and it's initialized to a value of 0. So I know that those concepts, or maybe even just looking at this, can be kind of confusing, but we'll have videos later on that go into what is this, like this keyword right here, and setting up states, this whole constructor function. But just for now, know that this is a stateful component and that we're defining seconds right here. Another key idea in React, and something that we see here in this stateful component, are these methods. So we have component did mount, component will unmount, and both of those are examples of something called lifecycle methods. So basically what lifecycle components are different methods that will run throughout the life of your component. And they're pretty well named as far as what they do, or not necessarily what they do, but when they'll run. So one of the lifecycle methods we see here is component did mount, which occurs right after your component shows up on the screen. And so this is a good place if you need to load data from an external API, you can make that call right here after your component has mounted. Another lifecycle method that you'll probably see often is one called component did update, and that's a way to see if there are props that have changed. You can compare what they were before to what they are now and see if you need to re-render something on your screen. And the last one we'll talk about today is component will unmount. So we see that here in this stateful component example. And what this is doing is clearing this interval function that was set earlier on. And so component will unmount is a good place to basically clear out anything right before your component unmounts. So you might have heard some things that you're unfamiliar with, even just looking at this example here, like the word this or the idea of props, but don't worry, we'll get into that in a later video. So now we've gone over some of the key ideas of React, some of the concepts that you're going to see over and over again. And in our next video, we're going to kind of get into getting started, setting up your environment, and then creating your first app.
So don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you don't miss the next video in this series.
So let us know in the comments down below what resources you guys have found helpful as you've been learning React yourself.
Thanks for watching. If you like this video, give us a thumbs up, and we'll see you later.